I knew why he married my daughter within 5 minutes of shaking his hand. Not because he said something wrong, because he said everything right. Too right, too fast, with eyes that kept drifting past me, measuring the house, the walls, the space behind my shoulders. Men who marry for love look at the woman. Men who marry for money look at the future, and he was already living in it. His grip was firm but rehearsed, smile controlled. He called me sir the first time, then quickly corrected himself to my first name, as if we were already family. I let it happen. I let everything happen. My daughter stood beside him, glowing in that way people glow when they believe they finally made the right choice. She was 32, smart, stubborn, independent, and blind in the exact way love makes you blind. I didn't blame her. I blamed myself for noticing what she couldn't and still smiling through dinner. We sat at the long table. He complimented the house without overdoing it, asked about my work, not my money, which is how I knew he'd already done his homework. People who don't know ask directly. People who know pretend not to care. He laughed at my jokes half a second too late, like he was checking first whether they were meant to be funny. When my daughter left the room to get wine, he leaned forward slightly, not enough to be obvious. You built all this yourself, he asked, glancing around again. I nodded. Impressive, he said. Must be nice to know your family's future is secure. That was the first line, not the worst, just the first. Over the next weeks, he became a regular presence, helped with small things, fixed a hinge, carried boxes without being asked. Always positioned himself as useful, dependable, harmless. I watched him learn the rhythms of the house, when I left, when I returned, which drawers stayed locked, which conversations made me change the subject. He never asked about money outright. Instead, he asked about legacy, about how I handled long-term planning, about whether I believed in keeping things simple or trusting professionals. He framed every question as concern for my daughter, always my daughter. I answered vaguely, on purpose. When they married, I paid for nothing. Not the wedding, not the apartment. I wanted to see what he'd do when the money wasn't handed to him. He didn't complain. That was smart. Complaints create distance. Gratitude builds access. Months passed. His tone shifted, slowly. He started using we when talking about family matters, started finishing my sentences, started suggesting ideas that sounded suspiciously like solutions to problems I hadn't said out loud. One night after dinner, he poured me a drink I hadn't asked for, said it exactly where I liked it. He said, casually, most people your age don't realize how exposed they are financially. I looked at the glass, then at him. Most people, I said, don't realize how much they reveal by saying things like that. He laughed, a quick one, controlled. Just thinking out loud. I smiled back, bigger than his, warmer. That's dangerous, thinking out loud around me. From that moment on, he became careful, very careful. But care doesn't erase intention, it sharpens it. I began keeping notes, not because I was angry, because I was patient. Dates, phrases, small inconsistencies. The way he remembered numbers too easily. The way he asked the same question twice, months apart, to see if the answer changed. I never confronted him, never warned my daughter. I needed him confident, comfortable, certain he was winning. And he was starting to believe he was. When he finally made his first real move, it didn't look like theft, it looked like help, like concern, like family doing what family does. That's always how it starts. The move came disguised as responsibility. He waited until my daughter mentioned, almost in passing, that I'd been tired lately. Nothing dramatic, just a comment over coffee. He didn't react immediately. That was important. He let the idea breathe for a week before circling back to it like it had just occurred to him. You've been carrying everything alone for a long time, he said to me one evening, tone careful, sympathetic. That kind of pressure adds up. I shrugged. Pressure keeps you sharp. He smiled. Until it doesn't. That was how he framed it. Concern for my health, my peace of mind, my future. He never said the word money. Instead, he talked about simplifying, about structure, about how families sometimes suffer because no one wants to have the uncomfortable conversations early enough. I listened, always listened. A few days later, he brought it up again, this time with my daughter in the room. Not directly to me, to her. "I just want your dad to be protected," he said. "If anything ever happened unexpectedly, things could get complicated." She frowned. "Complicated how?" He glanced at me, then away like he didn't want to offend. "Paperwork, access, decisions being made by people who don't understand what he wants." I noticed how carefully he avoided saying me. He never positioned himself as a solution. He let the silence do that work for him. I filled it in myself. "I've handled my affairs," I said. "Of course," he replied quickly. "I'm sure you have. I just meant things change." "They always do," he meant. Soon after, he suggested dinner, just the three of us, somewhere quiet. He chose the place. Expensive, but not flashy. A place where people spoke softly and trusted the menu without asking prices. He ordered wine I didn't recognize, claimed it was a favorite of mine. It wasn't. Midway through the meal, he told a story about a friend whose father had passed suddenly. No will issues, no drama, just delays. Assets frozen, family fighting. The story dragged just long enough to be uncomfortable. "I'd hate for that to happen here," he said. My daughter reached for my hand. "Dad, maybe we should talk about this stuff, just to be safe." That was the moment. Not because of what she said, but because of the relief on his face. The kind you see when a door opens exactly when you hoped it would. I nodded, slowly. "Maybe." From then on, the conversations accelerated. Not rushed, efficient. He offered to connect me with someone he trusted. A financial advisor, a lawyer, someone neutral, of course. Someone who could review everything objectively. I agreed to meet them, not because I needed advice, because I wanted to see who he'd bring into the room. The advisor was younger than expected, confident, too confident. Asked good questions but never waited long enough for full answers. I watched the way they exchanged looks. Subtle, quick, practiced. They spoke about consolidating accounts, about streamlining access, about emergency contingencies. All reasonable ideas, all positioned as hypotheticals. At the end of the meeting, the advisor slid a folder across the table. "No pressure," he said, "just options." I didn't open it. That night after they left, my daughter asked if everything was okay. I told her yes, that I appreciated the concern, that I was thinking things through. She hugged me, relieved. Her husband watched us from the doorway, silent, smiling, already counting steps ahead. What he didn't know was that I'd already met the advisor's firm years ago, on the other side of a dispute, that ended quietly and permanently. I knew their methods, their shortcuts, their tolerance for blurred lines. And more importantly, I knew exactly which documents in that folder would matter later. I let them sit on my desk untouched, just long enough for him to wonder whether I was hesitant or simply slow. Then I called him. "I've been thinking. You might be right. It's time to make some things easier." The pause on the line was brief, almost imperceptible. "That's good to hear," he said. And in that moment, I could hear it clearly. Not excitement, not greed, but certainty. He believed the door was open. Once he believed I was cooperating, he stopped hiding his impatience. Not openly, never openly, but in the way he followed up faster than necessary. In the way he remembered things I'd said weeks earlier and brought them back up as if they were decisions already made. He started talking in timelines. "We don't need to rush," he'd say, then add, "but it would be smart to have everything settled before the end of the year." The year was still young. He encouraged my daughter to spend more time with me, not because he wanted us closer, because he wanted her present when certain conversations happened. Witnesses matter, especially the right ones. One afternoon, while she was visiting, he suggested we all sit down together. No agenda, he said, just a family conversation. He brought documents, not the ones from the advisor, different ones, softer, easier to digest. A summary, bullet points, nothing that required signatures yet. "I just want us aligned," he said. Aligned, that word again. He talked about trust, about transparency, about how hard it is for couples when parents keep things separate, guarded. He framed secrecy as distance, and distance as risk. My daughter nodded along, uncomfortable but listening. You don't trust me? She finally asked me. I looked at her, really looked at her. I trust you, I said. That's not the same thing. He stepped in immediately. No one's accusing anyone of anything. But that wasn't true. He was accusing me of holding back. After that day, the tone shifted, subtly but permanently. He stopped asking permission and started making suggestions that assumed agreement. He'd say things like, when we restructure, or once everything's consolidated. I didn't correct him. Instead, I began making small concessions. I shared minor details, harmless ones, old accounts that no longer mattered, numbers that led nowhere. I wanted him confident, but slightly confused, enough to keep pushing. He took the bait. Soon, he proposed something bolder, not access, authority. Temporary, of course, framed as a safeguard. If something happened to you, he said, someone would need to act quickly. Banks don't wait, neither do courts. My daughter looked at me again, waiting. I asked him who he thought that someone should be. He didn't answer right away. He looked at my daughter, then back at me. Well, he said carefully, family usually makes the most sense. That night, after they left, I went through the folder he'd given me line by line, not to see what it offered, to see what it omitted. Clauses missing, language vague enough to be bent, signatures placed where pressure would eventually follow. I added notes of my own. A few days later, I told him I'd spoken to my lawyer. Not the truth, but close enough to matter. He agrees with most of this, I said. He exhaled, too hard. That's great. There's just one concern, I added. His body leaned in before he could stop it. Control, I said. I don't like losing it. He smiled. No one's talking about that. I nodded. Good. From then on, he became more careful around me and more aggressive around my daughter. I noticed the small changes, how often he reminded her of shared goals, how often he framed my hesitation as stubbornness. He never insulted me, he didn't have to. He just painted me as outdated. I considered stopping it, sitting her down, telling her everything. But I wasn't ready, because he still hadn't crossed the line I needed him to cross. He was circling it, testing, waiting for the moment he could step over without being seen. That moment came sooner than he expected. It arrived in the form of a problem he claimed he was solving for me, one I never asked him to touch. And when he mentioned it, casually, as if it were already done, I realized something important. He hadn't just been planning. He'd already started. He didn't announce what he'd done. He slipped it into conversation like it was a favor. We were alone in the kitchen. My daughter had stepped out to take a call. He poured himself coffee without asking, another small change, and leaned against the counter like he belonged there. I spoke to the bank, he said casually, just to ask a few general questions. I waited. They mentioned one of your older accounts hasn't been updated in years. Beneficiary info, contact details, things like that. I turned to him. You spoke to the bank about my accounts? He held up a hand, smiling. Nothing specific, no access, just general information. I was thinking about efficiency. Efficiency. That was his favorite word now. Banks can flag dormant assets, freeze them, create delays. I figured it was better to be proactive. I nodded slowly, as if processing. Inside, I was cataloging every word. What exactly did you tell them? I asked. Only what was necessary, he said. That I was family, that I was helping you organize things. Helping. Not authorized, not appointed, just close enough to test boundaries. When my daughter returned, he didn't mention the conversation. He didn't need to. He'd already planted the idea that he was managing things behind the scenes, quietly, competently, without bothering me. That night, I made my first call. Not to the bank, to my attorney. By morning, I knew exactly what he'd done, which account he'd referenced, and how far he'd gone. He hadn't stolen anything, not yet, but he'd initiated contact under assumptions that mattered legally. He'd created a record. That record would be useful. Over the next 2 weeks, I let him continue. I didn't confront him. I thanked him instead. Told him I appreciated the initiative. watched his posture change when he realized I wasn't pushing back. He started doing more. Emails on my behalf, calls I hadn't asked for, meetings to save me time. Each step small enough to justify. Together, a pattern. My daughter noticed a change in me before she noticed a change in him. "You seem relaxed," she said one evening. "I am. I've learned when to let people help." She smiled. He did too. What neither of them realized was that every action he took without authorization strengthened my position. Every assumption he made became leverage. Every helpful step created another line he'd crossed without knowing it mattered. Then he asked for something he shouldn't have. Not directly, not yet. He framed it as a hypothetical, a conversation starter. If someone needed to act quickly, documents could slow things down, unless someone already had limited authority. Limited, temporary, sensible. I didn't answer right away. I walked to my desk, picked up the same folder he'd given me weeks earlier, opened it, closed it again. "Let's talk about that later," I said. He nodded, calm, confident. But that night, I added a final note to my file, the last one before everything changed. Because the next step he planned to take would require more than assumption. It would require him to lie. And once he did that, I wouldn't have to let him try to steal from me anymore. He would do it himself.
He chose his moment carefully. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind people remember only because nothing seemed wrong at the time. My daughter was at work. He stopped by alone, unannounced, carrying a folder thicker than the last one. "I didn't want to bother you with this earlier," he said, setting it on the table. "But something came up." I didn't ask what. "There was a mix-up," he continued. "The bank flagged one of the accounts again. Nothing serious, but they asked for clarification." I looked at the folder. Still didn't open it. "They need confirmation," he said. "Just a formality." There it was, the word that always comes right before a mistake. "What kind of confirmation?" I asked. "That you're aware I've been assisting you," he said. "That I'm authorized to communicate on your behalf." Authorized. He finally said it. I leaned back in my chair. Let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. He filled it, of course. "It doesn't give me control," he added quickly. "It just avoids delays. Purely procedural." I picked up the folder, flipped through it slowly. Too slowly. I wanted him watching my hands, calculating whether this was the moment he'd been waiting for. "This isn't something I asked for," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it's something you'll eventually need." He was right, just not in the way he thought. I closed the folder. "Leave it with me." He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Of course." After he left, I made 3 calls. The first was to my attorney. The second was to the bank. The third was to someone he didn't know existed, a compliance officer whose job was to notice patterns exactly like his. By the end of the day, I had confirmation. Not suspicion, confirmation. He hadn't just spoken on my behalf. He'd represented himself as having authority he didn't possess. Not enough to trigger alarms on its own, but enough to be documented, enough to matter later. I waited. A week passed, then another. He grew restless, checked in more often, asked whether I'd reviewed the paperwork, whether there were questions, whether he could help clarify anything. I told him I was still thinking. That was when he made his mistake. He sent an email, not to me, but copied to me. An email to the bank referencing a conversation that never happened. A conversation where, according to him, I had approved his role. It was subtle, easy to miss. One sentence, one assumption presented as fact. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it. Not to him, to my attorney, to the bank's legal department, and to my personal file, where I joined the rest of his careful, patient work. That night, my daughter called. She sounded uneasy. "He says you're upset with them, that there's been a misunderstanding." I told her the truth. Not all of it, just enough. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm watching." There was a pause on the line. "Watching what?" "I'll tell you soon. Not yet."
He thought the delay meant uncertainty. In reality, it meant the opposite. Because once someone puts a lie in writing, there's no need to guess anymore. No need to protect them from themselves. All that's left is deciding when to let it surface. And I already knew the moment that would hurt him most. Pressure doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. He stopped pretending everything was fine. The warmth stayed, but the patience thinned. His messages became more frequent, shorter, framed as concern but carrying an edge. Just checking in. Did you get a chance to look at that? The bank's asking again. The bank wasn't asking. I knew that for a fact. My daughter started feeling it too. Not the details, the weight. He began looping her into conversations she didn't need to be part of, sharing just enough to make her anxious, just enough to make my silence look like avoidance. He says you're making things harder than they need to be, she said one evening. That you don't trust him. I trust patterns, I replied, not explanations. She frowned. That doesn't answer anything. It will, I said. At home, he grew more careful around me and more insistent around her. I noticed how he framed me now, not as a problem, but as an obstacle. Someone who meant well but didn't understand modern realities. Someone who needed help whether he wanted it or not. He never said it outright. He let implication do the damage. Then came the timing play. He mentioned an upcoming audit. Nothing serious, he said, routine. But audits create urgency. Urgency makes people sign things they shouldn't. He suggested it casually, over dinner, like he was thinking out loud. If everything isn't clarified before then, things could get messy. My daughter looked at me again. That look had changed, less trusting, more worried. I waited until she went to the kitchen. Which audit? I asked him quietly. He didn't hesitate. He named one, confidently. It was the wrong one. Not a small mistake, a revealing one. The kind you only make when you're repeating something you've heard secondhand or invented. I nodded, said nothing. That night, I pulled the final trigger I'd been holding back. Not dramatic, just precise. By morning, restrictions were in place. Silent ones, the kind that don't announce themselves until someone tries to move money that no longer moves the way it used to. He noticed within hours. He didn't call, he came over. His smile was still there when he walked in. His eyes were not. There seems to be an issue, he said carefully. One of the accounts isn't responding. Interesting, I replied. Which one? He named it without checking. Another mistake. I have been trying to handle it quietly, but it might require immediate action. From whom? I asked. He paused. Too long. From you, he said, or from someone authorized. There it was. Again. I stood up, slowly. You're very invested in this, I said. I'm invested in family, he replied. I looked at him. Then stop lying to mine. The words landed harder than I expected. His face changed, just for a moment. Not anger, fear. My daughter walked in. The air shifted. What's going on? She asked. He answered before I could. Your father doesn't trust me. He thinks I'm trying to take something that isn't mine. I didn't correct him. I simply said, soon we won't have to guess. That night, he sent one final message, longer than the others, calmer, a reset attempt. He apologized for misunderstandings, reaffirmed loyalty, suggested a clean slate. I didn't reply, because the moment I'd been waiting for wasn't about confrontation, it was about confirmation. And he was about to give it to me, publicly, permanently, and without realizing he'd stepped into the only position left open to him. He didn't wait long after that. 2 days later, my attorney called me before I'd finished breakfast. He reached out, she said. Not carefully. I smiled. What did he ask for? Authority, she replied. Immediate. Cited urgency. Claimed you were unavailable. Unavailable? That was new. He had tried to go around me. Not quietly this time, officially. By noon, the requests had multiplied. Banks, institutions, each one slightly different. Each one carrying the same assumption that he had permission, that I'd agreed, that I was slowing things down for no reason. I let it continue. By evening, my daughter arrived alone. Her face was pale, tight in a way I hadn't seen before. He told me everything, she said. I gestured for her to sit. He says you're testing him, she continued. That you're trying to see if he'll make a mistake, that you don't want to let go. I nodded. And do you believe him? She hesitated. That hesitation told me how much damage he'd already done. He showed me emails, she said. Messages. They look official. They are, I replied. That's the problem. She looked up, confused. I reached into my desk and took out a single sheet of paper. Not a stack, not a file, one page. This is a timeline, not opinions, actions. I didn't explain it, I didn't need to. I let her read. Dates, requests, statements he'd made without authorization, claims he'd put in writing, each one small on its own. Together, unmistakable. Her breathing changed as she reached the bottom. He said you knew, she whispered. I knew he would say that, I replied. She stood abruptly. I need to talk to him. You should, but not alone. He arrived an hour later, confident again, forced, but intact. He sat without being asked. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he began. My attorney joined us, then the compliance officer, then silence. The room changed. He noticed, too late. One by one, the assumptions he'd relied on were dismantled, not emotionally, procedurally. Each helpful act reframed as unauthorized representation, each shortcut labeled clearly for what it was. He tried to explain, to soften, to reframe. No one argued. When it was over, he looked at my daughter, not apologetic, calculating. She knew, he said to her. She always knew. My daughter didn't respond. Instead, she asked him one question, just one. Did you ever love me without thinking about what I came with? He didn't answer fast enough. That was the last mistake. He stood, straightened his jacket, tried to salvage dignity from a room that had already moved on. I think I should leave, he said. Yes, you should. As he walked to the door, he turned back once. You planned this, he said. I met his eyes, calm. No, I said. You did. The door closed behind him. We sat in silence for a long time. Then my attorney spoke. There's one more matter. I nodded, because the part he feared, the part he never saw coming, hadn't happened yet, and it was already in motion. He didn't come back for his things. That wasn't an accident. People who intend to return always leave something behind on purpose. He left nothing. By the next morning, his apartment was empty. Clothes gone, documents gone, even the framed wedding photo my daughter had given him was missing. But this appearance doesn't stop consequences once the record exists. By the time he realized how far it had gone, the narrative was already set, not by emotion, but by institutions. Banks don't argue. Firms don't debate intentions. They document patterns and protect themselves. His name became associated with a specific phrase he could never outrun: unauthorized representation. It followed him quietly. Applications stalled, calls stopped getting returned, doors didn't slam, they simply failed to open. My daughter didn't ask me what else I'd done. She didn't need to. She saw the effect before she understood the cause. Friends distanced themselves from him, opportunities evaporated, explanations stopped working. One evening, weeks later, she sat across from me and said, "He's blaming you." I nodded. Of course he is. He says you set him up. I let him act. There's a difference. She didn't argue. The marriage ended without drama. No court battle, no public mess. Just paperwork and silence. He didn't fight it. Fighting would have meant scrutiny. And scrutiny was the one thing he could no longer afford. Months passed. Life returned to its normal pace. Not the old normal, something quieter, more honest. My daughter started rebuilding without urgency, without illusions. One afternoon, she asked me something I'd been waiting to hear. Did you ever worry you were wrong about him? I thought for a moment. No, I said. I worried about being right too soon. She nodded. That night, I reviewed the file one last time, not because I needed it, because I no longer did. I closed it and locked it away, not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as proof of something simple. People who come for what isn't theirs always believe they're clever enough to take it quietly. They never imagine that someone might be patient enough to let them try. And by the time they realize the difference, there's nothing left to steal.